The file in front of you was never officially closed. The investigators moved on. The witnesses stopped talking. The leads ran dry, but the case never closed. What you are about to hear has been documented. The timeline, the evidence, the questions that were never answered. Welcome to case number unknown. Let's open the file. For 20 years, a quiet old man lived alone in a small apartment in Eastlake, Ohio. He kept to himself, spoke to almost no one, and seemed to want nothing more than to disappear into the background of ordinary life. Then, in July of 2002, he put a gun to his head and pulled the trigger. It should have been the unremarkable end of an unremarkable man. Instead, it was the beginning of one of America's strangest identity mysteries, a case that would take forensic science to its absolute limits and require nearly 2 decades to solve. When police entered the apartment of the man known as Joseph Newton Chandler III, they found a scene that raised more questions than it answered. The 77-year-old had left behind no suicide note, no family contacts, no friends to notify. His apartment was sparse, almost clinical in its emptiness. There were few personal belongings, no photographs, no letters, no mementos of a life lived. What investigators did find was a social security number, employment records from a local company called Lubrizol Corporation, where he had worked as an electrical engineer, and a name: Joseph Newton Chandler III. It was a real name. It belonged to a real person. But it did not belong to this man. The real Joseph Newton Chandler III was an 8-year-old boy from Rapid City, South Dakota. On Christmas Eve, 1945, the boy was riding in a car with his parents, Joseph Newton Chandler Jr. and his wife, when their vehicle was struck head-on by a drunk driver. All 3 members of the Chandler family were killed instantly. The boy never grew up. He never became an old man. He never moved to Ohio. Someone had stolen the identity of a dead child and used it to build an entirely new life, a life designed from the ground up to be untraceable. Investigators with the Eastlake Police Department quickly realized they were dealing with something far beyond a routine suicide. The man living as Chandler had obtained the dead boy's social security number sometime in the late 1970s. He had used it to secure employment, pay taxes, open bank accounts, and exist within the system as a seemingly legitimate American citizen. But before that point, there was nothing. No school records, no military service, no driver's license history, no medical records. The man had materialized out of thin air and wrapped himself in the skin of a dead boy's name. The question became overwhelming in its simplicity. Who was he? For years, investigators chased leads that went nowhere. They considered the possibility that the man was a fugitive, perhaps someone wanted for a violent crime who had fled and assumed a new identity. They considered espionage, given the man's apparent engineering background and his obsessive secrecy. They ran his fingerprints through every available database and found nothing. The case went cold, filed away alongside thousands of other unresolved mysteries in law enforcement archives across the country. But the world of forensic science was changing. In 2014, the U.S. Marshals Service took an interest in the Chandler case, assigning it to their Investigative Operations Division. They partnered with the Cuyahoga County Medical Examiner's Office and a groundbreaking team of genetic genealogists. The plan was audacious for its time. They would extract DNA from the remains of the unidentified man and use it not to match a profile already in a criminal database, but to build a family tree from scratch using publicly available genealogical DNA databases. This was investigative genetic genealogy, a technique still in its infancy, the same methodology that would later be used to identify the Golden State Killer in 2018. The DNA was extracted successfully from biological samples retained after the man's autopsy. It was uploaded to genetic genealogy databases, and analysts began the painstaking work of identifying distant relatives, people who shared enough DNA to suggest a familial connection. They worked backward through generations, building family trees, cross-referencing census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death records. It was genealogical detective work on a molecular level, the kind of investigation that would have been pure science fiction just a decade earlier. The breakthrough came in 2018. After years of meticulous analysis, the team narrowed the possibilities down to one man. The person who had lived and died as Joseph Newton Chandler III was, in reality, Robert Ivan Nichols, born on August 24, 1926, in Indianapolis, Indiana. He had served in the United States Army during World War II. He had been married at least twice. He had fathered at least one child. And at some point in the late 1970s, he had walked away from every single person he had ever known, stolen a dead boy's name, and vanished into a new life in Ohio. The announcement of his true identity was made on June 21, 2018, at a press conference held by the U.S. Marshals Service. It was a triumph of modern forensic science, but it was also, in many ways, the beginning of an even deeper mystery, because knowing his name did not explain why Robert Ivan Nichols had done what he did. Investigators looked into his background extensively. Nichols had grown up in Indiana. His military records confirmed his service. He had lived a seemingly normal life for decades before his disappearance. There were no outstanding warrants in his name. He was not wanted for any crime. He had not been the subject of any missing persons report that investigators could locate, which itself was strange. A man with family, with children, had walked away, and apparently no one had come looking for him, or if they had, their efforts had left no trace in the system. Some investigators speculated that Nichols may have been fleeing personal debts or a difficult family situation. Others wondered if he had been involved in criminal activity that had never been linked to his real name. The U.S. Marshals confirmed that they had investigated possible connections to unsolved crimes, including serial murder cases, but stated publicly that no definitive link had been established. The man appeared to have been, by all available evidence, simply someone who wanted to stop being himself. What makes this case resonate so deeply is not just the mystery of identity, but the mystery of motive. Robert Ivan Nichols did not steal a dead child's name to commit spectacular crimes or to live a life of luxury. He used it to become no one. He lived modestly. He worked a steady job. He kept his head down. He interacted with his neighbors as little as possible. The few people at Lubrizol who knew him described him as intelligent but deeply private, a man who seemed to carry an invisible weight. He retired from the company and then retreated even further into isolation, spending his final years alone in that small apartment in Eastlake. The forensic genealogy work that identified Nichols represented a watershed moment in the field. The case was one of the earliest successful applications of investigative genetic genealogy to a law enforcement case of this type, predating the Golden State Killer identification by only a matter of months. It proved that even the most carefully constructed false identity could be unraveled by the combination of DNA science and old-fashioned genealogical research. It also demonstrated the growing power of publicly available genetic databases, a power that carries with it profound questions about privacy, consent, and the limits of surveillance. For the living relatives of Robert Ivan Nichols, the revelation was a shock. Some had known a man by that name decades ago and had long since lost contact. Others had never known he existed. The discovery that their father, their relative, had spent the last quarter-century of his life living under an assumed name in a distant state, that he had died alone and unidentified, was a wound that no forensic breakthrough could fully heal. Today, the case of Joseph Newton Chandler III, the man who was really Robert Ivan Nichols, is officially resolved in terms of identification. The U.S. Marshals consider the identity question closed, but the deeper questions remain stubbornly, perhaps permanently, unanswered. Why did Robert Ivan Nichols abandon his life? What was he running from Or what was he running toward? Was he escaping something specific? A crime, a debt, a relationship? Or was he simply a man who reached a breaking point and decided to become someone else entirely? We may never know. The only person who could have answered those questions took the truth with him when he pulled that trigger in a lonely apartment in Eastlake, Ohio, on a summer day in 2002. And perhaps that was exactly what he intended. So let me ask you this. If a man can erase himself so completely that it takes the most advanced forensic science on the planet to discover who he really was, how many others are out there right now, living under borrowed names, hiding in plain sight, carrying secrets that will follow them into the grave? The investigation is ongoing. If you have a case you think deserves a file, leave it in the comments. New files open every week. Subscribe, because the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how long it takes.